Thank you both for coming.
Pleasure, so far.
Let's start with a big picture sort of roller coaster question. A year and a half ago, more than 180 countries got together in Paris to sign a climate agreement. Today, we are talking about how cities can possibly step into the void that's been created on that sort of federal level. What's been each of your reaction to this moment in history we're in?
Well, let me start actually with what I consider to be the good news before getting to the rest of the answer. On the good news side, what I would say is that after Paris, there is no going back. And I consider that to be the case for the United States as well. That is, we are going globally and nationally to a low-carbon economy. And I think the statements by business leaders tell you a lot about that, because they're not making long-term capital allocations on the basis of a high-carbon economy. They are committed to this. So I think that's good. That's good. It's good that the mayors and the governors and others in civil society are stepping up to take the lead. But I don't want to be Pollyannish. There's no doubt that the absence of federal leadership is going to make it a much rockier road, even if I think we're going to the same destination.
Right. Tom?
Well, I think that when where we are is a question of at least three things. One is the technology, one is the policy framework, and the third is the commercialization of that technology. And so when I look at that, the technology and the commercialization, this is a gigantic task for the world. To rebuild the world in a clean way is a gigantic task. And we need a policy framework that supports that and makes it happen faster. I agree with Ernie, it's going to happen. The question is, the fact that it happens isn't nearly enough. Because when we think about this, I think the way to think about it is we're in a race with nature, and we have to get ahead. And so, do I think that it is incredibly negative that the largest economy in the world, that has been the leading political actor in the world for decades, has done a 180 and has gone from leading the world in terms of trying to promote a clean economy to try and slow that down as much as possible and keep us in a fossil fuel economy? I think that's a huge fact. Will it be a determinative fact? That's what we're here to discuss today. Right. But there's no doubt in my mind that if the job of the President of the United States is at least partially to set a framework for Americans and the rest of the world to think about who they are and how they relate to each other and the natural world, this is a big step backward.
Right.
Could I just add to Tom's couple of points, which I certainly agree with. The first is that the drawing back from leadership in climate obviously has the climate implications, but I just want to emphasize an even, in some sense, broader implication that it is one more example where, unfortunately, incredible uncertainty in American reliability and leadership across the board is being put forward. Secondly, Tom mentioned technology and innovation, which of course, I completely endorse that. I want to just note that in terms of the administration's drawing back, we focus a lot on the June 1st announcement in terms of the Paris Agreement. But I would also like to emphasize that in that same time frame, the administration put forward its first budget proposal to Congress, and that slashed the innovation agenda, even as they say, oh, by the way, technology will save the day. So on both fronts, the administration has put forward very, very destructive plans.
And I want to get a more precise fix on your level of pessimism or optimism for the planet writ large. As we all know, the challenge we face is to keep the level of global warming below 2 degrees Celsius since the start of the industrial age. Everybody says if we go above that mark, that's when the bad stuff really starts to happen. Do you think we're going to limbo under that mark, or how worried are you precisely?
Tom, you want to go first?
Look, I think that if you really study this, we know a couple of things. One is 2 degrees is just a number. And it's not a number that once you cross it, that's where you are. I think the only honest way to answer that question is to think we are going into a place with a very high degree of probability that we don't understand and that no scientists understand. And that in fact, I would expect that during the lifetimes of the people sitting on this stage, we will be talking about how do we actually reduce carbon in the atmosphere. That we are going to go to a place that will be unsustainable. And so therefore, we're going to have to turn our attention not just to zero, but to negative. And I think that, look, this is a bet on the ingenuity and morality of human beings. I think that's a great bet because I'm a big believer in how smart 7 billion people are and how smart 320 million Americans are. But the fact of the matter is, until we accept the challenge and decide we're going after it, then we're going to keep going on the trajectory we're on. And we may do a lot of things that are positive. But if you think about it as a race, we are not winning the race until we decide we absolutely have to.
Ernie?
Yeah, agree with Tom, certainly. The 2 degrees is kind of a number. The real job is we have to keep the warming as low as we can. And it's all important. 2 degrees is a notional place where the projected impacts become extremely uncomfortable, shall we say, and expensive. In fact, another point that's maybe not emphasized enough is that, look, we are already in the adaptation phase. And every analysis always says that certainly the costs of mitigation are much lower than the costs of adaptation. I could give examples, like one utility in Florida already spending $4 billion in terms of hardening their electricity assets. But it's not only less expensive, it also gives you much more certainty that some really bad thing won't happen. Because that's where we have I would say, the major scientific uncertainty comes in the sense of some nonlinear things happening that are not part of the usual projection to 2 degrees. And that means, as Tom says, working to keep greenhouse gas concentrations as low as we possibly can, remembering that there's a lot of inertia in the system. So we've already baked in more temperature rise.
Can I make another point, Adam?
Sure.
Boy, we have a lot to say.
Yeah, I know.
Probably most of the people in this room have seen or read the New York Magazine article this week talking about how bad the impact of climate is going to be. But what I would say is this. Sitting here, and I'm kind of like a 12-year-old boy who reads baseball statistics. I like to read climate statistics. I'm fascinated with it. And the truth is, there's so many unknowns that Ernie's talking about that when you see those UN reports, they're basically projections of what we already know. And then there are a whole bunch of things that aren't in there because no one can know. And I'll give you 2 quick examples. The one I like to think of is, my mom is from Minnesota, and Minnesota people love the moose. It's a big symbol of Minnesota. And the moose were walking around Minnesota and just falling over dead. And no one could understand it. It turned out it wasn't cold enough to kill the ticks. So every moose had 2,500 ticks in it, and they were basically just being bled to death. Now, if you were thinking about climate science, who the heck would be thinking about ticks and temperature and moose? No one. So about 14 months ago, an oceanographer came into our office and said, we really don't understand what the ocean's relationship is to climate well. The UN doesn't, nobody does, because all the measurements, or they're not all the measurements, but they're mostly on land because it's so much easier to do it on land.
Right.
So we know a lot about the land, we know a lot less about the oceans. And then he started to talk about feedback loops in the oceans. So when we look forward to what's happening, you have to realize they're giving you a projection based on the known elements. And then there are all the things that Ernie's talking about, whether we release all this methane from the tundra, whether the ocean's role in absorbing the vast majority of the CO2 changes. There are a lot of things that are going to happen. So when we think about it, and people love to use the insurance analogy, like we should take out an insurance policy to make sure that the worst doesn't happen. If we're using an insurance analogy, our house is already on fire. We just don't know how big the flames are going to be, and we don't know if it's going to hit the kerosene, supply in the basement. And that's honestly the way to think about it. And when we start thinking that way, we can also realize we can solve this and be richer and healthier doing it. but there are big forces pushing back.
Right.
I just add one clear example of great relevance to a lot of cities, coastal cities, and Manhattan is certainly among them, is just the simple issue of sea level rise. So you go from one end where it is completely clear, not often realized, is that roughly half of the sea level rise is due to nothing other than thermal expansion of the water. The temperature goes up, the water expands, and the sea level goes up. It gets warmer as well, adds to storm surges. But then you go to, and then of course there's melting of ice, but then you go to the possibly catastrophic issue of the collapse of the West Antarctic ice sheet, of the Greenland ice sheet, and then you're suddenly talking about enormous sea level rises that would just either inundate or have a tremendously expensive adaptation approach.
So let me jump in. Let's go deep
Sure.
on the role of cities in all this. Take it in one of three directions. What can cities do to help? What are they doing? What should they do that would be most impactful? Take it in any direction.
Do you want to go first? Okay. Well, I thought about this question before coming here, and I think there are two ways to cut it. Ernie started on one, which is whether cities can lead in adapting to the problems or mitigating the overall problem. And I think there's no question that cities are going to take the lead on adaptation. So whether that is building seawalls, whether it's investing in pumps the way they have in Miami Beach, whether it is moving water treatment plants, which they're doing in Miami at enormous cost. There's
wearing flip-flops rather than leather shoes, right?
But cities are going to have to, because they're the closest people to citizens and families and communities, to deal with the adaptation. But I want to, if you think about the mitigation question, the prevention of the actual climate change, I try and think about that and I slice that three other ways, which is one, clean up electricity generation. 2, electrify everything. 3, increase energy efficiency dramatically. And when you think about a city from that standpoint, it can do things, but it can't do everything. Mm-hmm. So they can make big contributions. So if you think about clean up electricity generation, cities are not normally the place where you do the regulation of electricity generation. That's mostly done on the state level. So you can have municipal utilities. A bunch of cities have said, like San Diego was one of the first, we're going to go to 100% clean energy, and then they give a specific date. In order to do that, you have to create a municipal utility and make it possible to, in effect, create your own power. So they can do that, but in general, that's something where it's the states more than anywhere else where they do regulation of electricity generation. In terms of electrify everything, think about what we'd be electrifying. We'd be electrifying transportation is a huge fact. And cities can do a lot about transportation. They can do public transportation. They can have rules about cars. They can put in switching stations. But they can't determine how many EVs there are in the world. I guess they could forbid internal combustion cars from coming in, and some cities are going to do that, I expect. But by and large, they can't do the society-wide rules that would push for instance, the overwhelming electrification of transportation. Mm-hmm. And then lastly, increasing energy efficiency. Cities can do a lot there. Building codes are incredibly powerful in terms of how much energy is used in that part, and that is a place where cities really can do it. Mm-hmm. So I'd say when you look at this from a mitigation standpoint, you can see that cities can play really big roles, but they're not coordinated. It's very hard to coordinate them. And they can't do, if a good Republican friend of Ernie's and mine, George Shultz, were here and said, what does the society need to do to set a framework for us all to go forward and solve this problem? He would say society needs to invest in research, which Ernie referred to, and they need to set a price on carbon so that across every decision, everybody makes a competent commercial decision based on all the information, including the cost of pollution for society. And that's something cities really can't do effectively. So you can see they can play the leading role in adaptation. They can play significant roles in mitigation, but we won't get there, even if the cities do a terrific job, unless we have real coordination.
I'm going to give largely the same answer, but framed a little bit differently. First of all, I think it's important to say that, we talk a lot about Paris and the Paris goals, and those are very important. However, it's always been true, preceding the last administration announcement, that Paris is only a first step. So I think what Tom is implying certainly is that, and I certainly agree with, is that by mid-century, we are going to need, certainly in the industrialized economies, deep decarbonization. We're not talking here about 25, 30% reductions. We're talking 80, 90% reductions. That's the first point. And secondly, I have never seen a credible pathway to deep decarbonization that does not have in it the two factors that Tom mentioned: electricity becoming essentially carbon-free, and major progress on demand reduction. Now, cities, I'm going to be a little bit more positive than Tom in terms of what cities can do, only because of the demographic that by mid-century, globally, 2/3 of people will live in urban environments. And that's just that'll be ground truth, which leads to a lot of power in those locations. Clearly, it's best when it is in sync with, for the United States, let's say state and federal actions, but don't underestimate what cities can do. And that's because, in addition, the move to electrification, and I totally agree with Tom that we have to electrify everything we can to have a chance using zero carbon supply. But in doing that, in electrifying the city, and in going to the changes of how the urban area is organized, business models, it's not just electric vehicles, it's what are the business models for those vehicles, et cetera, et cetera. In the home, the Internet of Things integrated with electricity. What I want to argue is that there is also a tremendous value creation opportunity there, which in some sense is independent of climate, but is completely aligned with climate. If we can capture that, then we could go a long way, obviously preferably supplemented by good climate policy, but we can go a long way. But that value creation opportunity is not independent of what you raised in terms of the regulatory structures. Because, and this is a long story, I will anchor this in Amazon buys Whole Foods. The question is, what is going to be the synergy or the collision between utilities and big data companies in how all that value creation is captured? And if the regulatory structure ends up providing nothing more than a defensive safe harbor for the utilities, they're going to have big problems, and I think the value creation will not drive sufficiently the move towards a low-carbon future.
So if...
Complicated answer.
No, but if the answer is clear, where do we need to go? Deep decarbonization, right? You guys have each sketched out. We know where we have to go. What is stopping society from getting there? What are the biggest impediments to momentum at the local, state, federal level?
Well, I mean, think about where the CO2 is being emitted. And like, we've spent a ton of time as a society talking about electricity generation, and there has been a ton of work done to promote renewables, to come up with alternatives to fossil fuels, to come up with cleaner fossil fuels. But if you look state by state, there are still states that do the vast preponderance of their electricity generation in very dirty ways. Mm-hmm. And there are, even though that may not be the best economic decision, it may be the best economic decision for some of the actors in that system, so that they are pushing politically to keep those systems in place. This has turned out to be very much a political problem and a political solution. I think the second one that we're going to have to face is transportation. And if you look at those two areas, electricity generation, the Obama administration had the Clean Power Plan, which is off the table, which was to go state by state and ask people to make significant progress from wherever they were. If you look at transportation, the Obama administration has new so-called CAFE standards, which are just miles per gallon standards, coming in 2025. There's going to be a review of those. If we're going to, in fact, solve this as a society, we're going to have a governmental framework where industry understands the rules and they then invest against those rules. And those rules have to be consistent and long-term because the investments in these areas are very long-term. We are, I'll just finish by saying this. We are going to rebuild America between now and 2050. We're going to, because everything wears out over that time. So we're going to do it. The question is, are we going to rebuild it stupidly and therefore have to probably do it twice? Or are we going to do it intelligently, looking forward and not make stupid decisions that might look smart for a year and for the next 34 years are going to look dumb as hell?
Well, first of all, I think the good news is that there is momentum. And as I said, for a variety of reasons, I believe that momentum will continue. But as Tom says, it won't solve our problem without picking up the pace substantially. It's the time scale now that we are fighting against. That's where I do feel that we have another ally called Mother Nature, who will be complaining more and more loudly as we go forward, and we see the impacts. Actually, as an aside, I might note that I think this is approximately the 1,000th anniversary of King Canute telling the waves to keep off the beach. And often, by the way, that's misinterpreted. It's viewed as an act of vanity when it was just the opposite. It was to demonstrate that even a king did not have the power to influence nature. I wish we had a little of that humility today. Actually, it would be quite helpful. But the signals will get stronger, as I say. But we have to accelerate, and I'll just reinforce Tom's point that decisions taken in the next 5 to 10 years will largely be determinative of much of the outcome that we can expect in 2050. I'll just give one example. It may not be the favorite example of many, but you take nuclear power, which certainly in the past decades and today is the dominant, quotes, zero carbon electricity source. Obviously, it's an area in disarray, both with existing plants closing because of fundamentally natural gas competition, which is more carbon intensive, and new plants, Westinghouse bankruptcy, et cetera. So we've got, I would argue, we've got like 5 years to kind of either straighten that out or understand that it's not going to be a big part of the solution. So you know, it's really urgent in these next years to get the vectors going. And although a different point, I'll just say that when we did modeling of how to get to a deeply decarbonized economy, it was very important to see that tremendous innovation, technology innovation progress would really help a lot. It was easy to see how policy, say a carbon price, helped a lot. But the interesting point was when you did them both together, the synergy was very nonlinear, and you got really much deeper because it's pretty simple. The carbon signal led to earlier deployment of the low carbon technology. So in the end, you know, again, I don't want to be Pollyannish. The current administration view will make the road rockier, but I still feel confident that as the nature signals become stronger, we will get back to this synergy of technology and policy.
I'd like to make a point too about to get it back to the cities for just a second. And that's this. A lot of what we need for this to happen is about a policy framework, but it's also about a vision. And it's for us to all understand that we're on the same page, going to the same place, and that there's no turning back. And so normally that is the job of the President of the United States. You know, that is the bully pulpit that Teddy Roosevelt talked about. But the truth of the matter is, and I want to say this in terms of the cities, you have got to give Mayor Bloomberg a ton of credit for taking on that role, for saying, you know, this is where we need to go, there is a way to go here, and to really putting forward a vision. Now, that is not normally the role of the former mayor of New York City. But he's assumed it, and I think Jerry Brown's assumed some of that too, as the governor of California. And it's that kind of leadership that goes beyond any one law, that goes beyond any one rule, that's saying as a society, this is who we are, this is what we have to do, and this is how we're going to do it, that I think is part of what, when you think about cities taking on this mantle, it's hard to see them doing that. But actually, Mike Bloomberg is, I think, doing a very good job of doing at least part of that in a very credible way in the United States and globally.
I think I agree with that, and Mayor Bloomberg has been a real hero and has been and is a big hero. But I do want to emphasize that, in fact, he was a major part some years back of putting together, we should remember, a global coalition of mayors coming forward. And again, I attached that to the demographic of 2/3 of the world's population being in those cities. So I think they have a major role.
Quick question before we go to the audience questions. So much money and resources is spent on adaptation, right? Cities that are on the water. A big part of that is because everybody wants to live right on the water.
In
Waterfront
a city,
exactly. So how do we rewire our brains so that oceanfront property isn't the be-all and end-all?
You know what?
Well, okay,
Sun on water is one of the beautiful things in this world. And we're still human beings, and we still have emotional responses to life.
Right.
So, I mean, I'm from California, and the rule, Californians do not know this, but basically the rule is for every inch of sea rise, it's going to cost 8 to 10 feet of California beach. And we're talking about 2 feet of sea rise by 2050. So if you do the math, that's one hell of a lot of beachfront that we're going to lose. So really, when we're talking about this, you have to break it down into, you're asking the question of how do we adapt? And I hate to ask that question, because once you start asking that question, then you take your eye, I'm worried that you would take your eye off the ball of, could we please make sure this doesn't happen? Because it's an ounce of prevention really is worth a hell of a lot more than a pound of cure.
Yeah, exactly.
But I just want to emphasize a slightly different point, and that is that I kind of said it earlier, but we should also remember that the drive towards increased urbanization, and that, by the way, that means with an increasing population, it's another like 2.5 billion urban residents from now to 2050. But we should remember that cities, by their structure, do present tremendous opportunities for both mitigation and adaptation. And again, and that mitigation opportunity, I think, is well aligned, as I said earlier, with the value creation opportunities around electrification and the full integration of that with IT.
But I think there's one other point to it. Presumably most of the people in this room are Americans. And so we're used to a society that responds to emergencies, society-wide emergencies, with enormous amounts of cash. So for instance, after Katrina, I think as a society, we've spent over $20 billion on New Orleans, which is a city of 380,000 people. If you then take yourself out of the American context, where there is over $20 billion to spend on 380,000 people, and put yourself in the context of other countries that aren't nearly as rich, one of the countries that is traditionally thought to be most at risk in this climate crisis is Bangladesh, 160 million people. They definitely don't have $20 billion to spend on every 380,000 of those people. So in an American context, when we talk about adaptation, and we talk about spending $11 billion on moving a water treatment facility, we say that and we think, wow, that's really expensive, but we don't really blink. They don't have that money in a lot of places in the world, and that means it's going to cause reactions and ramifications that are completely different from here, where we're talking about budgets.
Great. Let's go to some audience questions.
Right here.
First, I really want to thank you for having this discussion because I can't get it out of my mind for about a year. I've been freaking out, but
Did we help?
Well, actually not.
The moose story didn't help.
Yeah, no, I mean,
That's why I told her.
No.
I could tell my own Beatles story
I mean,
from
I
the San
actually
Juan
think
Mountains.
you guys sugarcoated it because we're talking about being in the United States. I'm glad we're in the United States. However, I know it's going to take between 30 and 50 years before we actually, get done with having a carbon-based economies around the world. 5 years, forget about it. We're never going to make it in 5 years. We're never going. I mean, even if the United States actually were able to do that, which we won't because we're not organized that way to cooperate that way, we still have countries like China and India where the cheapest fuel is going to be oil. It's going to take years before those countries who are poorer are going to be able to electrify themselves so they can actually participate. So unfortunately, we have to talk about the whole globe. Now, I mean, what I really want to say is that mitigation, that we have to go to mitigation. We talk about adaptation, resilience. I mean, that's really nice. However, there is an end game to this. We start going into these feedback loops, especially at the Siberian,
Permafrost.
Yeah, the permafrost, which is giant methane. It's 25 times more potent than carbon dioxide, and it's going now. So we're going to have to resort to geoengineering, and a lot of the scientific community agrees with that. We have to cool the Arctic. So how does that happen? I mean, the only one person in the world who's actually said something is, what's his name? Macron. Have the scientists come to France and we'll figure it out. What I think we need to do is we need to have a Manhattan Project. I mean, we need to really organize the best scientists in the world to figure out how to take the carbon dioxide out directly from the air so we can cool it down. We're never going to get there in time to do it through our resiliency and adaptation, even though we want to do it. But I just want to ask one more question. Have you read Naomi Oreskes' The Collapse of Western Civilization?
Yes.
You read that?
Yes.
Okay.
Have you read Drawdown by
No.
Paul Hawken?
No.
Okay. Drawdown is the idea that we're going to have to actually take carbon out of the atmosphere.
Well, most of the scientists believe that.
And I think it's a very detailed look at all the different things, including some very surprising things with hundreds of scientists over 2 years doing research as a way of thinking about where this problem really is and what we can really do about it. But let me make one more point.
Yeah.
You're saying two things: that this is a gigantic problem that will cause immense suffering and damage, and that there's nothing we can do about it.
No.
But the truth of the matter is,
say that.
once people realize that this is an immense problem that can cause huge suffering and damage, the speed with which we can react to this will surprise everybody, in my opinion. And one of the things I always remind myself of is World War II.
Well, right, the Manhattan Project.
Not the Manhattan Project. We didn't make any passenger cars during World War II in Detroit. None. We made ships and we made tanks, but we did not make one passenger car because we felt like otherwise they may come and kill us. So when we decide that it's that level of threat, that we're not going to make a single passenger car in Detroit, then the changes will happen a lot more rapidly than people think. And the truth of the matter is, it's hard for me to believe that we're going to have 30 to 50 years of the world looking increasingly dangerous for everybody in this room and their children and their friends, and that we're going to not move to that level of reaction where we say, no, this is not an incremental change. This is something we absolutely have to do now in the most effective way, and you got to get out of the way if you're fighting us.
So let me just first of all clarify that neither of us said there would be the transformation in 5 years. What we said was decisions made in the next 5 years have very, very long-term consequences. as we think about a deep decarbonization by mid-century, which is tough, but that's what we have to aim at. I want to just comment on your geoengineering statement. Deep decarbonization, electricity, easy to see how you get there to zero carbon. You also have demand-side management. Transportation, more difficult. Industry, even more difficult. Buildings, heating, et cetera, will be very, very difficult. To be honest, I don't see how, even in the United States, industrialized country, I don't see how we get to 80 to 90% without something else. And that's going to require a lot of innovation in terms of some form of large-scale carbon management. But be careful. The idea of simply, let's say, cooling the atmosphere, throw sulfates up in the atmosphere. You will cool the atmosphere. However, you will not in any way mitigate the increasing, let's say, carbon concentrations in the atmosphere, and you'll kill the oceans. So, we need to innovate now with this multi-decadal feature for the big innovation breakthroughs that manage carbon on multi-gigaton scales per year.
Research, what you said, I agree. We need to actually pool resources for this kind of research. Okay, anyway.
One more question? Sir.
Sorry, is that on? Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. I'm sorry. Jeffrey Anton. Just a quick question. My brother asked me, why is it different that, why is it a problem that Antarctica is melting and not the Arctic? And I said, well, one is floating and one is on top of, a continent, and when it rolls off, it makes the oceans higher, and not vice versa. That comment to me made me question whether we really have the right messaging. Are we confusing, as an engineer and scientist, are we confusing people by talking about global warming and these big amorphous questions that even I have a hard time explaining to people, when really sea level rise is just so concrete and right in front of you when it's happening in front of our eyes? Have we failed in our messaging to the rest of society? Could you comment on that?
I think it's almost a tautology that we have failed in our messaging. But the first question I want to just emphasize that the differential warming of the Arctic versus the Antarctic is present in all the models that come out. Ultimately, it's because the northern hemisphere has got a lot of land and the southern hemisphere doesn't.
So let me talk for a second about the messaging. In 2010, which now is 7 years ago, I co-chaired with George Shultz a no to a proposition which was attempting to roll back the progressive energy laws in California. And we spent a lot of time thinking about how can you talk to citizens who are going about their normal life about energy and climate in a way that's meaningful for them, just along these lines. And what we ended up doing, which I think was the first time that people did it, but which I think is now kind of the standard, is to talk about jobs and health. That in fact, the way that people relate to clean energy and the way that they relate to global warming is actually through the question of, is this something that will increase jobs and pay in my community and for the people I know? And is this something that will increase clean air in my community, particularly for the children in my community? And in fact, those are messages that hit on a gut level in every community across America and resonate. The traditional way to defeat this idea of moving to clean energy has to be to say, and it's been repeated 1,000 times with zero backup, that it's a job killer. The truth of the matter is, if we move to clean energy, we will create millions of net new jobs, and those will be higher paying jobs. That's almost the most important message for Americans to hear, is that when they call it a job killer, they are lying. And they are intentionally lying because it is a good deal still for a bunch of people who own fossil fuels.
I agree with what Tom said, but I do want to add that, even today, it's true that, for example, we've lost a few tens of thousands of coal mining jobs. We've gained, just in the last several years, over 200,000 solar jobs. But the reality is they're not in the same place. And that's why I think, just pick up what Tom said, I think we both are very committed to the idea that we need to take much more of a worker and community focus, which inherently is local and regional in terms of addressing those needs, but especially helping bring together those local and regional assets, innovation assets, that can demonstrate how these communities can be part of a low-carbon future with prosperity, with job creation that keeps kids, if they want to be, closer to home, for example, rather than having to move. Those community structures, frankly, we've done not nearly enough in putting that at the core of our climate strategy.
I think we can squeeze in one more quick question. Genia?
Right there.
Hi. So you briefly touched on this now with your messaging, but the country just elected somebody who made the promise to make us great again, as idiotic a statement as that is. But from the left, too, we're seeing a big push towards going back to the way that things used to be in terms of local food movements, slow food movements. Using bicycles in cities has become a huge means of transportation. So how can you, I guess, in terms of messaging as well, kind of fuse the looking forward in terms of clean energy and the technology and these huge, massive moves that we need to make globally versus at the local level, people inherently reverting to their human nature?
Well, we're never getting away from the fact that politics are always local and human. So the minute that you're not, I mean, I think that was the point I was trying to make. The minute that you're not talking about a local human issue, you're not talking about anything that anyone cares about. I think the difference is this. I think it's incumbent on us to be able to put those local human issues into a context of the future and a vision of a better America. And I think if you go back through American history, really the job of leaders, whether it's FDR or JFK or Teddy Roosevelt or Abraham Lincoln, is to say, this is the future, this is how we're going to get there, and it's going to work for you and your family. So when I think about Make America Great Again, I don't confuse myself with that, because I think Make America Great Again, who does that mean? You know, by definition, that was an attempt to appeal to a small slice of America, because if you're African American or Latino or LGBTQ or a woman, you don't want to go back to where we were. We've actually made great progress. The key to me is to say, in energy, we're going to rebuild a clean America. It's going to create jobs all over America, because, for instance, if we're going to do energy efficiency, that means rebuilding buildings in every community. And so the question is going to be, how are we going to organize that? How are people going to get paid for that? And how's it going to work in terms of clean air and jobs? And if we can, my point is, that is a huge task for our generation, with a gigantic goal, but also a goal of doing it together, because we actually have to do this together. And when people understand that, that is something where we can go back to thinking about America being a forward-looking, positive place, trying to create a better world for everybody, not going back to a place where it was better for a very small minority of people.
Quick final thought?
Yeah, since Tom answered your question, I'll just answer different questions. One is on the, just as an example, it's very interesting on the jobs front, is when I was in Iowa last year, the governor talked about how they were going to considerably ramp up their wind production, even though they were already the largest wind producer per normalized to population. The reason being simply, it was a business attraction, because so many companies wanted zero carbon energy that they were using this as a method of economic development. And the interesting thing is, just a couple months ago, it was announced that Kentucky, coal state Kentucky, is doing the same thing, wind for economic development. The second point I'll make is goes back to the earlier issue of urban design and how urban design can evolve. This may be more relevant to developing countries where cities are still being built, quite literally. Just want to give a little, maybe a nice little vision to end on as to how that future can really improve the environment. Imagine building it with around this idea of, let's say, fully electrified transportation. Suddenly, the quality of air is different, the noise environment is different. Well, suddenly, maybe you can build your buildings differently. Maybe you don't have to completely inoculate yourself from the outside. It's a whole different way of thinking about how the city could be organized. That's part of the value creation and the quality of life issue, I think, that we really have to emphasize. That and the jobs, and we can make a lot of progress, I think.
We could talk all day on this important topic, but please join me in thanking Tom and Ernie.
Thank you.
Thanks, Adam.
Great, thank you. Great, thank you. Great.